Hi there, hi everybody. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, I guess you can. Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you all so very much. I guess, yeah, I want to start with a round of thanks, actually. So thank you guys for coming out tonight. This is really great and actually quite impressive. So many people of you here. This is fantastic. Thanks, Sophia, for this very kind introduction and for making explicit the need for solidarity. So not that I have any part in any of this, because I teach in Bavaria, but sounds pretty great what you guys are up to tomorrow, so perhaps it might be worth joining. You know, just a thought. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. Then thanks especially to the working group Feminist Philosophy. I don't know, the AG Feministische Philosophie. I didn't realize that you guys were doing this on your own dime. I mean, this thing is spectacular as it is. I mean, when Marie Mikola left the Humboldt to go to Oxford, this was sort of a severe blow to feminist philosophy in Germany. So it's great of you, like, to pick up the slack and carry on the good work, and that you're doing this on your own time and dime. This is really miraculous. So perhaps let's give a shout out to them. And as a general word of praise and as a more particular word of thanks, and thanks for inviting me. I'm really incredibly happy and honored to be here. So many great people gave talks before me, and the lecture series is going to go on and be great continuously. It's amazing to be part of this. So thank you all so very much. But enough of the thanks. Now to disrespect. Okay. This is what we're going to do tonight. We're not going to disrespect one another, but we're going to talk about what it would mean to disrespect one another, how this works, and why we shouldn't do that. This is my topic for this evening, and as Sophia was kind enough to point out, this is a topic that's sort of close to my heart and very important to me right now, because it's part of my Habilitationsprojekt. So this is something I'm currently working on. Plus, I do think it's really important to better understand this. Okay, so before I give you an overview over my talk, so I'm going to show you what I want to do tonight, I first want to introduce the main question, so in order to help us all zero in and focus in on what we're going to discuss tonight. And so the general idea is the following. In the current analytical philosophy debate, which is the debate I'm more or less familiar with, or at least this is what I feel like I'm working in, there's plenty of literature on the notion of respect. There's great work done by Stephen Darwell, and there are also really nice and helpful texts, for instance, by Thomas Hill or by Robin Dillon. So there's plenty of stuff on respect, but almost none on disrespect. And to me, this has always been sort of odd, because, at least to my mind, it seems that the phenomenon, the real life phenomenon of disrespect, is all too common, in general, and in particular so for people who are sort of seen as belonging to a marginalized group. That's an intuition I have. And just to see whether we are on the same page in this regard, let's try to do a quick show of hands. So who of you has either witnessed disrespectful behavior or actually experienced disrespectful behavior in their lives? So, show of hands here. Yeah, and isn't this odd? So this is something that seems to be happening to a lot of people, and no philosophical work, or at least not a lot of philosophical work is done on that. And so now all the people who raised their hands, first up, sorry that you had to go through this, but if you try to summarize these experiences or the stuff you witnessed, in one sentence, could you describe that? I know this is not good for the recording stuff at all, but if you would shout that out, that would be really helpful for me for the rest of the talk, some examples.
Harm.
Excuse me?
Harm.
Harm, okay. Anyone else wants to contribute? A paradigmatic, disrespectful experience you had or you witnessed. People getting harmed, for instance. Anything else that comes to mind? Okay, we'll see. So then I'm going to present you with a concept, and you'll just try to see whether what you experienced fits into this concept. Okay, so that's the main question, and what I want to do tonight is first, I'm going to discuss how we should best understand the phenomenon of disrespect. And the idea, or ideally, all the stuff that you would describe as disrespectful behavior would be captured by the concept as I propose it. So that's the first part, the descriptive part. I would want to describe what disrespect should be best understood as. And then I want to also explain what is morally problematic about disrespect. So that's the more normative part. And in all of this, I'm going to engage in non-ideal theorizing because, as you'll see, the examples I'm going to draw on are actually cases where stuff goes wrong, actually pretty wrong. So, I mean, you could go about this in another way, right? So you could try to figure out what disrespectful behavior is by thinking about what respectful behavior is. And I guess if you'd do that, you'd be engaging in ideal theory. And for reasons I can't get into now, but I'm happy to explain later in Q&A, I think doing this stuff in a non-ideal way makes much more sense. And so this is what I'm going to do. And roughly speaking, that's what's on the agenda for tonight. So the talk has two broader parts. The first introduces some conceptual constraints. So these are constraints I want to make explicit and then take into consideration while I'm developing my concept. So I'll first present my starting intuitions, then I'm going to show you some previous attempts at capturing what disrespect is all about, and also try to point out where I think these previous attempts fail. And then drawing from that, I'm going to introduce some conditions of adequacy, so some stuff a good philosophically sound notion of disrespect should live up to. And then in the second part of my talk, I'm going to try to present you with a philosophically sound conception of disrespect. And I'm first going to shout out where I get my idea from, namely from Kant. Then I'm going to present you with my own account, and I'll finish up by discussing a possible objection. And I hope that all of this takes around about 35 to 40 minutes, so that we have plenty of time for discussion. Okay, so on to the starting intuitions, the stuff I want to start my project with. So in the following, I'm going to assume the following three things. For starters, I think that disrespect, or if you want to put it in the most general terms, to disrespect another person is to somehow disregard her moral relevance or her moral standing. This is supposed to be the roughest, most broad description of the phenomenon. Everything that comes afterwards in this talk is my attempt of spelling this out. But the general idea is, if you're disrespecting a person, you're somehow not taking into account that this person matters, that there's something about her that you should take seriously. That's the broad idea, and I think a sound account of disrespect should capture that. Another thing I'm assuming is that disrespect constitutes a moral wrong. So if we're disrespecting other people, we are actually wronging them. I'm not sure, so what goes on in the background here is a debate that's currently going on between about the distinction between moral wronging and harming people. And again, this is something I'm not going to delve into now, but if you want to know more about this, we can talk about this in Q&A. But so what I want to claim is not that disrespectful behavior harms people. I guess it does that too. But what I want to go for is the stronger claim that even if nobody got harmed by disrespectful behavior, it would still be a moral wrong. And finally, given that disrespect is a moral wrong, on my view, I think we also have a right, so I think from this it follows that we have a right not to be disrespected. So all of you who raised a hand earlier, that they already either witnessed or experienced disrespect, so I guess what you lived through was a violation of your rights. And so this is the stuff I want to capture. And I guess this stuff is general enough that everybody who thought about disrespect tries to capture it. And at least the two people I'm going to present to you now, in their previous attempts of capturing the notion of disrespect, try to do justice to the starting intuitions I just presented. And so, to these previous attempts, the two philosophers I'm going to discuss now, like very shortly, are Joshua Glasgow and Benjamin Idelson. Glasgow wrote a paper that's called Racism as Disrespect, that came out in Ethics 2009. And the quote from Idelson is from his book on discrimination and disrespect that came out with OUP 2015. And so what these guys are saying is the following. According to Glasgow, disrespect is something like a failure to adequately recognize autonomous, independent, sensitive, morally significant creatures. So here we have a sort of like an attempt to define what disrespect is all about. Idelson, unfortunately, does not provide us with a definition of disrespect. What he does give us is a definition of respect, and I think we can deduce from that what disrespectful behavior would be like. So his definition of respect is the following. To respect persons as persons, one must treat them as autonomous beings that are of value. From which I take it that to disrespect persons as persons, one has to fail to treat them as autonomous beings that are of value. So I think both these attempts are actually pretty good. So I think they capture something important. This sort of sounds true to me. It's not that I think they're like completely off track or something. Nevertheless, I think this is not all disrespect can be about. There's something problematic about these accounts. And what's problematic about them is the following thing. So on Glasgow's and Idelson's understanding, if you think about disrespect the way these guys do, every moral wrong counts as an instance of disrespect. And the reason for this is the following. Whenever a person gets wronged, so whenever somebody's rights are violated or somebody is harmed in a particularly nasty way, we can say that the person who did this, the perpetrator, failed to recognize the target as morally significant creature or failed to treat her as a being of value. So imagine any sort of moral wrong. So imagine a person stealing from another. You could quite sensibly redescribe this as, by stealing from her, the perpetrator did not treat her as a being of value, or by stealing from her, the perpetrator did not realize that she was morally significant. So I think what Glasgow and Idelson do is give a general description of disrespect that's not wrong, but simply too wide. And that's problematic. So why is it problematic that it is too wide? If we think about disrespect in this way, disrespect is not a distinct moral wrong anymore. It's rather the case that the notion disrespect became a synonym for every type of moral wrong. And I think this is first not really intuitive. I think there are instances of wronging a person that would not be, that we couldn't redescribe as instances of disrespect. So I think there's something counterintuitive to this move. But more importantly, it's sort of philosophically unsatisfying, right? So what we're doing is we've been setting out in order to discover a new moral phenomenon, namely disrespect, and all these guys have been giving us is a synonym for something we already know, namely moral wronging in general. So I think this is just, it's not fruitful philosophically, which is why we should go look for another concept. But what Glasgow's and Idelson's accounts are really good for is to develop conditions of adequacy. So I think what we can get by thinking about these accounts is how to, like conditions, a useful notion of disrespect would fulfill. And I take these conditions to be the following three. A philosophically useful notion of disrespect should conceptualize the phenomenon of disrespect in the following way. Disrespect should come out as a moral wrong. So it should be the case that if you're disrespecting someone, you're doing something morally wrong. And that's the second condition. It should be that in disrespecting someone, you're actually committing a particular moral wrong. So disrespect should be a particular type of moral wrong and not just a synonym for moral wronging in the most general sense. This is what I take away from the two accounts I've presented you before, like in the most literal sense. And the last condition I want to put forward is the following. And in this, I guess I go over and beyond what Glasgow and Idelson want disrespect to do, at least in the quotes I provided you with. So I think that a philosophically useful notion of disrespect should make it the case that certain types of actions have to be considered disrespectful. And the first types of actions I'm thinking about are torture and slavery. So I think torture and slavery are paradigmatic cases of disrespectful behavior. So that's just an intuition, like a moral intuition I have, but I hope that this one is more or less widely shared. And another thing that should come out as disrespectful behavior, at least on my take of things, is the following. I think that instances of structural discrimination should also be instances of disrespectful behavior. I have the vague notion, the vague hope that in this particular room, most people would agree that discrimination is disrespectful behavior and that structural discrimination is too. I'm not sure whether this would be widely shared in different contexts, but I'm just, I'm putting it out there. And so, to explain what I mean by structural discrimination, again, I think most people who attend this particular lecture series already have a notion of what I mean by this, but just to put it out there. So imagine an employer who refuses to hire women because he's sure that every woman at some point in time will go off, have kids and take care of their kids and not come back to the job anymore. And he just thinks that it's sort of a, poor return on investment to hire women. This is an instance of structural discrimination, and I think we should have the philosophical tools to brand such behavior as disrespect. So this is what I want my notion of disrespect to be able to do, fulfill these three conditions. Okay. And so much for the first part of my talk. So these were the conceptual constraints I wanted to put forward. And from now on, I'm going to move to the constructive part. So everything that comes from now is my attempt to present you with a philosophically sound and useful notion of disrespect. And as we all know, in our philosophizing, we always sort of stand on the shoulders of the people who philosophized before us, right? So we take the problems we think worth investigating from other people. We take up the notions we do our investigations with from other people. And so it's just fair to give credit to those who have inspired us. And funnily enough, the person who inspired my account of disrespect is Kant. And so, sorry, now like 10 minutes, Kant. Good. So what I find interesting about Kant for my work on disrespect is a part of the Metaphysics of Morals. The part, actually, what I'm going to talk to you about now is a part from the Doctrine of Virtue. I think that's in English, the Tugendlehre. And there Kant says something about our duties of respect for other men. And before I'm going to tell you what he thinks our duties of respect for other men actually consist in, 2 words on Kant's notion of respect. But before that, short break, sorry. Kant makes me thirsty, I don't know why. Good, so Kant and the notion of respect, right? For the crazily systematic and precise thinker he was, unfortunately enough, Kant's usage of the term respect, Achtung, is ambiguous. So Kant uses respect to mean 2 separate things. And I think most of you who have attended a course on practical philosophy or a course on Kant know Kant's usage of Achtung in the sense of the self-wrought feeling that's motivating us to act morally. That's the usage of Achtung or respect that we find in the groundwork. And this is not what I'm talking about here at all. So the respect I'm talking about here is not this self-wrought feeling. And the only way Kant has to disambiguate to these 2 different notions of respect is by turning to Latin. So when he talks about the self-wrought feeling in the groundwork, what he means is respect as reverencia. And the stuff I'm going to talk about now is respect as observancia. And I don't think this is important for what I'm going to do at all. This is just a terminological point for those of you who are interested in Kant. So if you're not, just forget the last 5 sentences. Good. So, about the respect as observancia, which I'm interested in. So what does Kant believe we owe other people out of our duty of respect. So he thinks we owe them not to engage in the following vices: arrogance, defamation, and ridicule. So the paradigmatic instances of disrespectful behavior, the stuff we have to do in order to violate our duty of respect for other men, is to be arrogant, to defame them, that is to talk bad stuff about them, and to ridicule them. That's what disrespect consists in for Kant. And now, this is interesting for me on a couple of different levels. So, for starters, given this understanding of disrespect, it turns out that for Kant, not every moral wrong is an instance of disrespect. It's just these three things I've just enumerated: arrogance, defamation, and ridicule. Just some moral wrongs are instances of disrespect. And this is sort of great for me, or rather great for Kant, because thus he'll be able to fulfill the first condition I stated, the second condition I stated, because he won't end up with having a notion of disrespect that's synonymous to morally wronging people in general. So that's good. But if Kant restricts what counts as disrespect, we'll have to ask ourselves, this sort of naturally raises the question, what is it then that unites arrogance, defamation, and ridicule? So arrogance, defamation, and ridicule are supposed to be instances of a different phenomenon, namely disrespect. And what is it they share, so that we can say all of these actions are disrespectful actions? And my claim is the following. I think what these types of actions share is their communicative aspect. And by this I mean the following. So when we're arrogant towards people, when we let them feel that we are better than them, or that they are worse than us, or when we defame them, that is when we talk shit about them behind their backs, when we ridicule them, what we do is we deliberately communicate something negative about them. I think this is what's going on in all of these three types of actions. It goes about in different ways, right? So arrogance is not the same as, for instance, ridicule. But in each case, something negative about the target is communicated either to the target herself or to the wider audience. So put differently, I think for Kant, arrogance, defamation, and ridicule are disrespectful insofar they communicate something negative about their target. And so, what are we to make of Kant's approach? So I think firstly, I think his picture fits the first condition, because communicating something negative about a person, this could count as a moral wrong, right? So if we go out and tell people nasty stuff about a common friend of ours, this is something we shouldn't do. This is something that's morally not okay. So communicating something negative about another person, this could count as a moral wrong. And if we are willing to accept this, then disrespect, as on Kant's approach, is a moral wrong and thus fulfills my first condition. And I've already said that Kant's account also fulfills my second condition, because not all types of moral wrongs are disrespect, because simply not all types of moral wrongs have this communicative aspect. What Kant's account fails, I guess, is my third condition. And I think it does so because, and I think it's particularly clear that it does fail the third condition when you think about structural discrimination, because I take it that in many cases of structural discrimination, the people who engage in the discriminatory behavior, they're not out to communicate anything. And in particular, they're not out to communicate anything about the people they're discriminating against. So again, think of the employer who doesn't want to hire women because they're poor return on investment. This might just be all they mean to do by their action. Perhaps all they want to do is to avoid hiring women because this will cost them later on. Perhaps they don't intend to say anything negative about women at all. Perhaps they actually think it's sort of great that women are so naturally great at caring for people that they then all get pregnant and stay at home with their kids. So I don't think that in every instance of structural discrimination, the people who discriminate intend to communicate negative stuff about their targets. But if this is so, then Kant's approach cannot capture structural discrimination as an instance of disrespect, and thus fails my third condition. And that's bad for Kant and pretty good for me, because this then means that we need another approach than Kant's. And here comes my own account. And in what follows, I'm going to present you with my notion of disrespect, and I'm going to do this in 3 steps. I'm going to present you with my definition. I'm just going to put it out there. Then I'm going to explain some of its parts, because some of its parts are sort of fiddly and need an explanation. And after that, I'm going to present you with an example. And I have the hope that, like, these 3 steps, the definition, the explaining the definition, and then the example, put together will give you sort of a grip on what I mean by disrespect. So bear with me for 3 slides. You have to take them like all in a row, and then I hope it makes sense. Okay, so the definition. I want to argue that A's action or behavior X is disrespectful towards another person B if and only if and because this action or behavior X communicates that B has diminished moral standing. So the communicates parts, you see this is what I take from Kant. Okay, that's my definition. And now on to the explaining it, to spelling it out. So I think the first thing that needs explanation is the diminished moral standing thing. So what do I mean by that? Broadly speaking, I mean the following. So I think an action communicates that, if an action communicates that B has diminished moral standing, what this action communicates is that B can legitimately be treated worse than other people. That's the general idea. That's the general idea because different theories of morality will give you different ways to spell out what it means to treat other people worse, to treat a person worse than other people. And just two more words on that to make this clear. So I guess some of you might have already had like an intro to practical philosophy, and so you know that there are different theories of morality around. Like the 2 broadest camps are something like deontologist ethics, like Kant's, for instance, and consequentialist ethics, like utilitarianism. And so if you're a Kantian, to say that you believe that a person has diminished moral standing would probably mean something like you believe that they have less rights than other people, because deontological ethics do their work by drawing on the notion of rights mostly. If you're a consequentialist, or more particular, if you're utilitarian, you'd say that to have diminished moral standing would be something like when people deliberate about which option to choose, the question how much the possible alternative affects your individual well-being does not have to be taken into account at all, or only to a lesser degree than the individual well-being of other people. So what I want to say here is that what disrespectful behavior comes to depends very much on your background moral theory. But I'm not going to engage in the question which background moral theory is the right background moral theory, because this will take like forever. So just plug in your favorite account of what morality obliges us to do. Okay, so much for diminished moral standing. The other notion that needs explaining is the communicates part. So how is it that an action communicates? The general idea is the following. So whenever we see people doing stuff, we read something out of them doing that stuff. I think this is like, that's a pretty straightforward thought. This is not supposed to be fancy at all. I do think that we have to have a theory in place to spell out how this works, and I want to propose the following. So an action communicates something if the following thing is the case. So given the shared beliefs in A's and B's community, the fact that A performs her action X speaks in favor of the assumption that B has diminished moral standing. What I mean by this is the following. So we interpret the actions of other people, we read them as meaning something given a background of shared beliefs. This is all I want to say here. Okay. And as I said, I think all of this is going to make much more sense when we're discussing an example. So now let me present you with an example. So I thought long and hard about what kind of example to choose. Again, I think disrespect is a pretty common phenomenon, so there are unfortunately plenty examples to choose from. The one I'm going to present you with is a pretty, so not to say it's not nasty, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not the worst instance of disrespect we can come up with. I still think it's a good example to discuss, for starters, because I hope it does not trigger anybody in a very unpleasant way. And as you'll see, it's taken from the context of academia, and as this whole thing here is happening in the context of academia, I thought that, I don't know, perhaps some people could relate. Good. So that's my example. And I'm just going to read it out. The example is called Professor Emeritus and goes like this. B is invited to give a philosophical talk. In Q&A, a Professor Emeritus from the department gets up and delivers a 10-minute monologue on the topic of B's talk, without ever referring back to anything the speaker said and without asking her any specific question. Neither the chair nor anyone in the audience tries to intervene on B's behalf. So I guess, I don't know, perhaps some of you can relate. Perhaps you've witnessed something like this. If so, I don't know, I feel for you. Good. So I present this as a case of disrespect. So I start with the intuition that the behavior the Professor Emeritus displays here is disrespectful behavior. And what I want to show now is that, given my account of disrespect, this is actually the case. And let's see how this goes. So I guess we have, so in the community we're discussing about now, which is academia, there is the following shared belief. Not explicitly, but I think this is something most people could subscribe to. Namely the idea that a Professor Emeritus knows how to behave himself in public. At least he would not do something that is completely out of line, especially not in an academic setting where there are like lots of witnesses around, say. I think this is a shared belief. This is like a sensible assumption to make. So this guy is not going to make a fool out of himself in public. And what we then do is we see what he's actually doing. So we observe his behavior. And what he does is he completely ignores the speaker. So he gets up there for 2 minutes and goes on, 10 minutes and goes on and on and on. He's simply ignoring her. But if we assume that this guy would not do something out of line, and if we then see him ignoring the speaker, what his ignoring the speaker speaks in favor of, given our background assumption that he would not do something that is out of line, is that it's not out of line to ignore the speaker in this context. So what we get is the speaker in this context can legitimately be ignored. And this, to me, is an instance of the idea that the speaker or this person can legitimately be treated worse than other people. And this is what disrespect boils down to on my definition. So again, let me explain what I just did. I presented you with a concept, I tried to elaborate on it a bit, and then I presented you with an example. I hope you shared my starting intuition that the case I described is actually one of disrespectful behavior, and I've just shown you how my notion of disrespect can actually bear out this intuition. Let's see whether my notion of disrespect also bears out the conditions I established before. So remember, my first condition was, condition of adequacy, stuff a useful notion of disrespect should fulfill. The first one was that disrespect should be a moral wrong. So there should be something morally wrong about disrespecting people. And now think about what instances of disrespect do. Instances of disrespect communicate that the people who are targeted are beings of diminished moral standing. And as such, instances of disrespect, what they do is they spread falsehoods about the moral standing of the people who are targeted. They spread false assumptions about what we can legitimately do with these people. And another way to describe this is simply to say what they do is they poison the moral climate. They bring it about that people falsely start to believe that a subset of the community can be treated worse than others. And doing this, poisoning the moral climate, bringing people to believe wrong stuff about the moral standing of other people, that's moral wrong. Especially so if we take into consideration that people tend to act on their moral beliefs. So if we wrongly assume that people have diminished moral standing, we'll act on that, and that's certainly morally wrong. So I guess this goes to show that my notion of disrespect fulfills the first condition. On to the second condition. The second condition stated that disrespect should be a distinct moral wrong, not just a synonym for all kinds of moral wrongs. And again, I think my notion bears out this condition because not all morally wrong actions communicate in the way I just described that the target has diminished moral standing. And to see this, think of a garden variety case of theft. So you go to a supermarket and you see a person there stealing some stuff from the shelves. And usually this happens in the following way. So they do this surreptitiously, right? So they try to hide the fact that they're like letting something fall into their bags. They're not making a great show of it. They're trying to hide this. What they're doing is they're committing a moral wrong. They're stealing. But they do this in a way that that makes it hard for us to interpret this as a case of it's okay to steal, it's okay to rob the shopkeep of their stuff, because they do so surreptitiously. So again, I'm trying to make the same point in different ways. I think if you see a person stealing from a shop, what you see is a moral wrong being committed, but you don't get the impression from that in doing so, we are also communicating that it is okay to steal stuff. If this were the case, I'd have a problem, because then all types of moral wrongs would have this communicative aspect, and then all types of moral wrongs would be disrespectful, but I don't think this is the case. And so on to the third condition, which stated that specific types of actions should be considered instances of disrespect, namely torture, slavery, and structural discrimination. And again, I think my notion can make sense of this. I take it that this is sort of fairly obvious for torture and slavery, because often it's the implicit or even explicit intent of the perpetrators of these crimes to make their targets believe that what is being done to them is actually okay, that they can be legitimately treated that way, that it is okay to act so horridly towards them because they have diminished moral standing. I take it that this is part of what makes torture psychologically so very taxing, that the people who are subjected to torture are made to believe that what's happening to them is something they deserve, that this is something that can be legitimately done to them. So, same goes for slavery. So I think these two instances, for these two types of actions, the idea that there's something communicative about them is pretty straightforward. Not so much so in the case of structural discrimination, but I think we can put the pieces of the puzzle together here. So when it comes to structural discrimination, so when we're talking about the discrimination of people because they are part of certain marginalized groups, what's also the case is that there are all sorts of false beliefs about these marginalized groups in the, let's say, common ground of the community we're talking about. So this is one thing of what it means to be marginalized. A lot of people think crazy stuff about you. But if a lot of people think crazy stuff about you and then see some people treating you worse than others, they have a sort of background narrative to make sense of this behavior the people of this social group are subjected to. So if you're like the shopkeeper who believes that women are natural carers, and you see other employers not employing women, you have a story why that is so. And so because to be marginalized means that there's a wrong story about you that's part of the common ground, this makes it then the case that actions, when people treat you wrongfully, they have a sort of narrative to fall back on by which they can interpret what is going on. So I think even structural discrimination, or on my account, we could make sense of why structural discrimination has the communicative aspect that disrespectful actions are supposed to have. So this is all good, right? So this means that the definition I put forward lives up to the conditions of adequacy I presented. So all fine, not quite. There's at least one objection that came into my mind. I guess you guys will present me with a lot of more questions and puzzles, but at least one of them I'm trying now to preempt. And that's the following. Think of the following, like, slightly tweaked version of the example I presented you with. That's the example, ignorant jerk. And again, I guess some of you might have, like, witnessed a situation similar to this. Again, he is invited to give a philosophical talk. In Q&A, a participant everybody in the audience knows to be an ignorant jerk gets up and delivers a 10-minute monologue on the topic of B's talk. Again, without ever referring back to anything the speaker said and without asking her any specific questions. Neither the chair nor anyone in the audience tries to intervene on B's behalf. So, exact same case, it's just not a Professor Emeritus doing the dirt, but everybody in the audience knows to be, like, ignorant. What's going on here? Again, I think intuitively what we want to say is that the behavior of the jerk is disrespectful, right? So, like, when you hear the examples, it's a natural, like, one description that comes to mind is to say he was just so disrespectful towards the speaker. Problem is, if everybody knows that he's a jerk, it could be the case that there's the following shared belief. An ignorant jerk does not know how to behave himself in public. This is part of what makes him a jerk, right? What we then see is his action of ignoring the speaker. But given that we are assuming that an ignorant jerk does not know how to behave, what he does can then not speak in favor of any assumption about how to treat the speaker, because we've already sort of discarded from the beginning that we can learn anything from this person, him being such an ignorant jerk. So the problem here is that intuitively we'd want to qualify the jerk's behavior as disrespectful, but given my notion of disrespect, we can't say that. What shall we do here? I guess on this one, I'm simply biting the bullet. What I want to say is, so I'm accepting the challenge as the jerk does not communicate anything about the speaker's moral standing. He can't do that because we take him to be a jerk. He cannot disrespect her on my account. So his action can't be morally wrong in this regard. It can't be the case that he does something wrong because he's disrespecting the speaker. This is where I'm biting the bullet. I have to accept this. What I can say is that he tries to disrespect her, right? So what he does is he displays a type of behavior that is sort of risking to disrespectful. If we had any other background assumptions about him, he would probably succeed in disrespecting her. And so perhaps it's that what makes his action morally objectionable. So perhaps it's that captures our intuition from the start that there's something going on here that's fishy. It's not that he's disrespecting her because he can't, but it might be the case that he's trying to disrespect her, or he's risking to disrespect her, and that this is what we're actually picking up on with our gut feeling that what he's doing is problematic. And so I'm not sure whether biting the bullet is actually a counter to an objection, but at least this is the way I would react to it. Okay, let me sum up. What I've started from was the assumption that what we need as philosophers is a useful concept of disrespect to adequately describe, unfortunately, the social reality. So this is what's going on. We need a way to describe this. What I've also tried to show is, like, very shortly, that previous attempts to spell out the notion of disrespect have so far been too wide and are therefore not philosophically useful. And instead, and this is what I've been arguing for in the second part of my talk, excuse me, we should understand those actions as disrespectful that communicate that the target of these disrespectful actions has diminished moral standing. Thanks so much.